So the theme of the panel is particularly relevant today, as this has been an exceptional year for everyone around the globe. We're constantly hearing about adjusting to the new normal, the pandemic that's enabled an acceleration into more connectedness, paving the way for Industry 4.0. And while many technological innovations are asserted to be universally positive and beneficial to communities worldwide, and most importantly, that it's usually connected to the notion of globalization, and that it's a facilitator of globalization and bringing the world together in a global village. A closer examination, however, reveals unequal dynamics and structures of who holds the power, who has agency, whose interests are promoted, and how technology in some cases has increased existing inequities. So joining us here today is a panel of distinguished guests who bring in different perspectives and who have done extensive work on this issue. And before I begin the discussion, if we can do a round of introductions and have each panelist introduce themselves briefly. So we can start with Anwan.
Hello, everyone. I'm Anwan Simmons. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. Thanks for tuning in. I am an engineering coach at Help Scout, so I've worked for almost a quarter century building enterprise software for a living. But my night job has been trying to dismantle colonial powers, the patriarchy, capitalism, and all those things that are causing a lot of the problems that we're going to talk about during this panel. So happy to be here, happy to be a part of this conversation.
Happy to have you as well. And then we can have Ten-Marie introduce yourself.
Jai Bhim, everybody. My name is Ten-Marie Soundarajan, and I'm Executive Director of Equality Labs. And we are a national organization that works on the issue of Dalit civil rights. And we have a very particular focus in looking at caste in tech and caste in many American institutions. And I'm really looking forward to joining this conversation to make the links of what decolonization looks like in the context of caste apartheid, and how to really see material solidarities at the ways that we want to unpack these problems, but create shared solutions. So really honored to be here with my panelists today.
Thank you. And our third panelist is Professor Safiya Noble.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you too, and such an amazing panel. I feel so honored. My name is Safiya Noble. I'm an associate professor at UCLA, and I co-direct and co-founded the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. I'm also the author of the book, Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism, and really looking forward to this conversation today.
Great. And I don't know if, Anwan, you mentioned that you're also the author of Minority Tech during your introduction. And so before talking about decolonization, first I want to point out to the audience to feel free to ask questions throughout the conversation. We'll also be dedicating some time at the end for Q&A, but feel free to post some questions on the chat or in the other platforms. So we want to first identify what aspects of technology or tech policy is subject to modern colonialism or domination. Assuming that this new space or virtual territory we all reside in, who are the colonizers in this context? Which community is the most affected? Who benefits the least? And what are the technological tools of domination, so to speak? So Anwan, if you'd like to start with answering this question.
Yeah, I think that the colonizers are the people who have been able to profit off of a radical imbalance in terms of power that they've been able to gain from creating platforms, and particularly looking at social media sites. But I think that this is in general also greater technology power imbalance, where we have these social sharing platforms that, it all seems so innocent, right? Oh, I can post pictures of my friends and show my grandmother where I went for my vacation, and I can do all these things, and they become more and more full featured. And, most of all, it all seems free. But as the old saying goes, if there's no price, then you are the product. And so these companies have monetized the free information that people have given up on their platforms. They have gotten a great amount of power, and they are beginning to resemble the colonial powers of old, who took the power that were given and began to enforce their skewed view of the world. So yeah, I think that a big part of the modern people who are acting colonial in our world are big technology companies.
Professor Noble, would you agree? I mean, or is there anything else to add to what I said?
Well, I certainly don't disagree at all. I mean, I think that what we're talking about are the ways in which people relate to technologies, for the most part, until, let's say, the last solidly 15 or 20 years of critique of tech that has mostly come from Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQ scholars and journalists. Most people were framing technology in terms of these kind of ephemeral ways of thinking about computing, whether it be kind of in the cloud or the kind of online versus offline sensibility. And what we know is that the critical scholars have really brought forward much more of the material dimension of technology. And of course, that's the material effects, the consequences of media platforms, but also through the entire supply chain, the global supply chain of the materiality by which technology comes into existence. And so these, again, are highly political processes that indeed do reflect old, if you think to other colonial movements like the Scramble for Africa, the desire to control different kinds of material resources, minerals, other types of extractive technologies, those are part and parcel of the way in which big tech, for example, and let's say little technologies that are not household names, are reliant upon. So these extractive, racialized, capitalistic practices of colonization are in fact the exact same kinds of processes that are indeed very material and not ephemeral entirely. So I think it's really important as we start the conversation just to be attuned to what we're talking about when we're talking about technology. We're talking about technology as a set of social, economic, and political practices.
That's very interesting. And Ten-Marie, what's your perspective on that?
I mean, I think that, Sophia's work is like such a really profound, path-breaking place for many of our conversations around this. But, I think what's important is that what we're seeing in this moment is like surveillance capitalism and its intersection with these dominator cultures, whether it's white supremacy or Brahmanism. And I think that we need to have, really strong conversations about the material nature of the way that these technologies are deployed in our communities and who profits from it, as well as what those consequences are. Because I think a lot of times, like the techno-utopianism that really undergirds like a lot of the stars in our eyes around technology, that's just marketing. Nobody believes that a white dude who went to an Ivy League school and, built a platform to get hot chicks has the competencies to understand what it takes to run a global platform, in democracies that are under crisis. And yet that's exactly what Facebook is, right? And when you think about their profit engine being based on, getting many, many markets to the point of crisis because their staff lack the cultural competencies and that they're supportive of administration that destabilize, democratic practices in those countries. Those are all colonial practices, right? What would what did colonial masters do? They would find the puppets on the inside, do what they needed to destabilize local power, and then use it all to be able to extract. And the thing is that in the environment of, the internet economy, whether it's Africa or Latin America or Asia or South Asia, we actually have the power. We are the next billion users. We are not in, a beggar bowl situation with Silicon Valley. And yet they still want to create those dynamics where they're the developers and we're the users. And I think this is where this critical intervention of decolonization and de-Brahmanization is so critical. because we can be the engineers of our own future. We do not need to take shitty tech with a bad business model that puts us behind for another 100 years in terms of an extractive data practice that doesn't put our communities in a place of sovereignty. And I think this is, de-Brahmanization and decolonization, I think, is not just a call for like understanding the problem. It's actually a visionary call for creating the future, because there's no need for us to like rebuild Facebook, right? Like if it's a shitty product, let's throw it in the trash can, right? There's tons of venture capital. There's amazing amounts of talented developers and policy thinkers who can create an alternative around it. Let's do it. I just think at this point, it is like ridiculous that we keep having hearing after hearing holding these tech companies accountable when they're not willing to change, because their business model is based on making money off of genocide and the destruction of democracy. And that's colonialism at its core, this like deep predator model of economics at this, with the expense of humanity. And we don't need that anymore.
Right. So since you brought up the issue of, the hearings and the most recent one being with the Silicon Valley executives, I believe 2 weeks ago, what do you make of that? I mean, do you see, especially Professor Noble, since your work focuses a lot on Google in recent years and its business model, do you see this as prospect for stopping Google in its tracks and therefore being able to shift from a free market model to possibly a public interest one?
Well, certainly not with the way that the Department of Justice has constructed their case against Google right now. We're not moving in that direction of a public interest kind of paradigm, let's say. But I think certainly the curtain is being pulled back more aggressively around big tech with respect to a series of antitrust hearings that have been held over the past year. And I think that those are really important in terms of the incredible work that many, many people are putting into educating policymakers right now. I mean, this is like our full-time job in some ways, to make the research and interventions available to policymakers globally. So of course, this is important that we're even at a point where these tech company CEOs are being grilled in a variety of different ways. We can see in 10 years that the policymakers have gotten much better about asking tough questions than they were in the last series a few years ago. So, all of that is positive if you're talking about, slow reform, which is indeed what that channel is. Usually, though, when we're talking about things like decolonization, we're not entirely interested in slow reform. We're actually interested in, and we know that indeed decolonization happens through more revolutionary kinds of strategies and deployments of tactics and ways of thinking, quite frankly. They're paradigm shifting kinds of moments that have happened throughout history. So I think the real challenge is to how do we use the hearings as a site of leverage for a much, much larger conversation that isn't about the very, incremental and slow reformist strategies that might come forward from a very long and protracted Department of Justice investigation. That doesn't mean we should abandon the kind of electoral channels. We should use every channel available. But I think that there's different roles for different people to play in accelerating the kind of change that many of us want to see.
Mm-hmm. And when we see technologies emerging, we assume that the evolution of technology is on a certain path and that this is a continuous development of innovation and such. However, a lot of all of your work implies that these are paths driven by human decisions, essentially, and that there are alternative paths that are not being directed to. So how do we begin to think of decolonization in that sense? Like you said, I mean, if you want to look at it at a much bigger picture, like on a global level, if we have income inequality, if capital is disproportionately allocated around the globe among different groups. And then those are the ones making the decisions about how tech is developed and eventually impacting the rest of the globe. We don't want to just think about how the US government is responding to these companies, US companies, who all have a global presence. So how do you think about decolonization in that sense? Anwan, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, I like to really riff off what Dr. Noble said. I think that it is good that the current's being pulled back on tech companies, right? Google's had antitrust hearings outside of America, right, in Europe. And I think that we are beginning to see progress there. I think that uh, we have done this before. We have broken up Standard Oil. We broke up Bell System, and so these big conglomerates have been broken up before. But I also want to say that the challenge of today is that so much money is poured into our politics. That one, it really adds a lot of just taint to the system, into the process, and two, I have a general distrust of the current administration in a lot of ways. So even though the Justice Department has brought forth this antitrust case against Google in particular, I think that we'll have to wait and see. But I think it will have to be played out at two levels. One is, as these government agencies seek to regulate and to control these companies, there's that, but that can be really a long, I think, and slow process. But then there's the stuff that we can do. I mean, as said very well before, we don't have to use these horrible products. We don't have to use these products that monetize genocide, that monetize the disruption of our democratic systems, that treat people like products. We can find alternatives that are created by people of much better will. And so I think that there's a role that everyone who is watching this can play. And I think that we can, in many ways, vote with our feet. You talked about technology making progress and having, companies having so much control over that. Technology progress does not operate in a straight line. I mean, I've worked in many software companies, and what you see shipped to production is the result of many iterations of an idea over a long period of time. And so that progress is non-linear. But that doesn't just happen inside of companies. The way that we as consumers view these companies, as we begin to understand the way that they seek to disrupt our lives, then we can also go in a different direction in terms of how we use them, and really take away their power. But I think it's going to be the people on this panel who are educating people about that. But it has to be people who are willing to make a change.
Any of the other panelists would like to chime in?
Sure. I mean, I think that, just to kind of like step a little bit back, I think that when we're talking about decolonization, or I use the term like de-Brahmanizing in the South Asian context, with technology, I think it can be really easy to just think about this through the diversity lens, like, oh, if we just have more diverse engineers. But I think what we need to do is actually think about, what does the system of colonization do? This predator system erodes local control, takes away innovation from the heart of the people that are facing most of the problems, and then removes it so that any things that you try to do to ameliorate or shift it or change it are like nearly impossible, because you have to travel millions of miles to get there, and speak a language, or have a data set that you might not have technical access to, right? And I think that the obfuscation, the power shifts that occur with that's what we want to change with decolonization. And with tech in particular, it is also, just as it is important to talk about the nature of white supremacy and the consolidation of tech powers in the global north, particularly in Silicon Valley, and the United States, it is also really important to look at the role of caste power in these equations as well. Because with the IT sector, we have so many South Asian engineers and the South Asian community as a whole that define and create this culture. And 1 in 6 people in the world are South Asian. I mean, 1 in 6 people in the world are Indian, 1 in 4 are South Asian. And the biases that we have in our own context not only shape the discrimination and violence that we see, destabilizing our region, but it also shapes and connects like the way that we serve tech to the rest of the world. And so it's really important to look at how these internal hegemonies in our context, shape a global conversation around decolonization, because what did Indians play in the role of the English Empire? Oftentimes we were the brown roadblock in terms of Black liberation. And also we played very critical colonial roles in terms of the administration of the English, wherever the English operated. And I think when we look at the ways that we see, platforms like Facebook and Google and Twitter engage in the global South, we see criminal levels of, engagement in the way that they've disrupted democracy and made money off of genocide. And I think that, to give you an example, like in the United States, we have a very strong, grassroots BIPOC movement that has really built power to hold these platforms accountable. When you talk to organizers like from Color of Change or Media Justice, these are very, very savvy organizers who didn't necessarily have data sets, but were able to get a seat at the table because of their own bases and the clarity of their analysis about what needed to change, about how Facebook and Twitter were allowing white nationalists to be platformed in our country. In the global South, it's completely different. If you are an organizer in the global South dealing with genocidal language, to even get a seat at the table with the companies, you have to have a data set. Can you imagine if you are not a technologist, but you're getting genocidal level hate speech directed at you? How are you, most users in the global South that experience this, if they're not in a STEM field, if they're not literate in that context, how are you supposed to explain or create the methodology for tracking what you're seeing in terms of disinformation or hate speech? You can't, right? And this is what happened with the Rohingya in Myanmar. This is what's happening right now in India, with the genocidal policies that are occurring there. And when we have American companies that are the equivalent of IBM in genocidal contexts, and we're not doing anything about it as Americans, we're also complicit with like a colonial dynamic. But I think what's so different about this moment is that we have such strong movements of oppressed peoples, whether it's, movements for Black liberation or Indigenous sovereignty or Dalit liberation, that there's no reason that we can't create material solidarities around these predator companies and to ask for different policies. And while we're moving to shift big tech, I think it's really important that we have technologists from these communities being able to have enough capital to be able to innovate new business models that don't extract the living future out of us, because I think that's, every time you talk to someone from a big tech company, they're like, yeah, I mean, this is a really hard problem to solve. That's because your entire engineering development room is not diverse, but more importantly, you can't solve around a bad business model. So what would a social media platform, what would data practices look like that have community sovereignty at the center, that would be based around solidarity economies? I think that it's their lack of revolutionary imagination that we have such shitty products. So let's get different creators and let's let our people try. Because in this moment, the next billion users are not in the global north. They're in Africa, they're in South Asia, they're in Latin America. And you're not going to get people in the United States to be able to design for those next billion. It's going to be those people themselves. So we should be thinking about how to create co-design models that center these values of equity so that we're not just fixing bad tech, we're actually innovating the future together. And I think that's where there's so much possibility when we take this into a making frame and we take all of the skills that we've developed around decolonization and de-Brahmanization to really thinking about what is the new that we want for each other,
Mm-hmm. A lot of interesting points made there. Dr. Noble, any thoughts? How do you envision this?
I mean, there's nothing yet that I can disagree with. I mean, I think that these things are so beautifully said by the other panelists. And, you know, I want to address a couple of dimensions of this just to like, you know, tease out and build and add and say that there are also, you know, beyond kind of the raw political economy of dehumanization that comes with decolonizing. There are ideologies and cultures of colonization. And this is really gets at one of the things that was just said about global solidarities and even understanding our economic and social and political relationships to each other. And this is one of the things that colonization, in fact, you know, in the 1950s, for example, really obscured. People, Americans, for example, didn't understand how profoundly tied to colonization their own thirst and quest and agency around things like the automobile, and the kind of liberatory possibilities that were in fact indeed afforded to people who otherwise had not been able to travel because of Jim Crow terrorism, because of other kinds of violence that was enacted against our communities. And you know, when the automobile came about, it stood as a kind of liberatory possibility for people and families to move about in more protected ways. But it, of course, was directly tied to the extraction economies of the Belgians in the Congo, who were extracting rubber to make the tires that fueled the automotive industry, right? And so there's so many ways in which these particulars have to be discovered, put in dialogue and understood so that it is not simply conceptual, but that we profoundly understand. I mean, for me, it is insufficient when I teach computer science and engineering students to say, like, you know, make a better app. You know, I say to them, like, make a device that we can eat when we're done, that can grow a tree, that can intervene upon climate change. The entire model of the hardware is predicated upon extraction and environmental exploitation and labor exploitation. So we have to get very specific when we're talking about what our interventions will be, because I actually don't think that the interventions will be better software applications that lay over deeply, profoundly problematic hardware. And, you know, when we talk, my colleague, Sarah Roberts, who co-directs the UCLA Center for Critical Internet with me, you know, we talk about what does it look like to decolonize the stack? So at every level, if we're going to talk about computing, there's possibility for decolonizing. And I think one of the challenges is that what software and kind of media platforms have done, the brand name ones we know, has really kind of captured our imagination to try to focus on intervening there. And of course, the most narrow focus is around things like hate speech. Well, of course, hate speech has to be handled, but the entire infrastructure facilitates all kinds of horribleness. So I think we have to figure out what we're talking about and get very specific. We need more students and more researchers going into these spaces, more organizers, so that we indeed have exactly what we've been talking about so far. The stories to intervene upon the cultures, right? Because one of the challenges that I see, for example, with a lot of people of color who are trying to move into talking in this space is, you know, we talk at the level of like, you know, less exploitive apps, but we don't try to decolonize the stack. And of course, we've got to look at the stack. So I think these things are important. The ideologies of colonization, let me just say, kind of the cultures of technology. The cultures of technology are about, they have co-opted and captured our words. The early technologists in Silicon Valley, the libertarians, you know, their model, they took our words like liberation. That's no coincidence. They've also captured our words now when we talk about oppression, when I talk about algorithms of oppression, I'm using oppression because it's actually a word that is profoundly politically tied to different traditions that are not the traditions of corporate capture of words like diversity and inclusion. So I think we're going to have to also spend time with language and culture and the ideologies that are so profoundly connected to this sector, so that we're really clear what kind of interventions we're calling for. And we understand where they kind of rest in a continuum, again, of like a radical new imaginary, or just, tweaking the algorithm, which quite frankly, we have a huge new cottage industry of people who are interested in things like ethics and AI that, as far as I'm concerned, is just kind of like corporate capture of the, progressive imaginary. So, there's a lot to lose here in the realm of not just making and technology. And of course, that includes the imaginaries of computer science. And this is where I would, invite, dialogue with people who are thinking about code beyond the binary. I mean, we study the danger of racial and gender hierarchies. We understand that the binary logics of hierarchical systems always put women, LGBTQ, Black, Indigenous, people of color at the bottom of the hierarchy. And yet all of our computer languages in the West or the global North are predicated upon binary systems. So we gotta get in so many different ways to disrupt these logics, rather than thinking about like a shiny new overlay.
Mm-hmm. But then why is that? Why is there already this this hierarchy in technology, when we think that technology is an equalizer? Why are these groups marginalized in this way?
Well, I'll just say, in terms of computing languages, these are derived from other kinds of hierarchical systems that we have inherited from science and from other, anthropological endeavors, right, to classify the human condition. And of course, if we think about these technologies, they really stem from Enlightenment philosophies that, again, predicate Africa and Asian countries and peoples, indigenous peoples, as again on the bottom of these hierarchies and these philosophical ways of ideologically seeing the world and seeing people. These are the logics upon which these systems rest. And there's, if you've got ones and zeros, no matter the language you're using, and this is for me, I mean, I come out of the field of library and information science. All we do is study the classification of knowledge and ideas, and which ones get foregrounded as a canon and which ones get erased from existence. And so I think we have to actually deal with some of these underlying logics. And of course, the project of decolonization has also been a project of destabilizing the the logics of Aristotle and other mathematicians, quite frankly, whose whole paradigms are predicated upon these hierarchies of power and the dehumanization of people of color. That's just a fact. And I think those are the math courses, quite frankly, that should be taught. Those are the kinds of, when you want to talk about decolonizing computer science, let's start with math and CS and their philosophical origins. And when you do that, then you start to see how incredibly precarious this is. When you fast forward and accelerate that into business models, you're talking about systems that are actually very grossly, very roughly and coarsely capitalizing off of these systems of classification. Who gets predicted into opportunity? Who gets predicted out? Who's worthy? Who's not? Where do you live? What did you do before? Who's your cousin? All these things are going to decide, and over-determine our future. And so this is why I love this conversation, because it is about the local kind of loss of agency that's happening all over the world, at a personal, community, and societal level. And these systems make it incredibly opaque and very, very difficult to intervene upon. And this is why we have to keep having these conversations.
That's very interesting. Tenmori, have you come across such a similar experience from your work in Equality Labs?
Well, I mean, I think that, what I'm hearing, from Sophia and also from Ajwan is that, in many ways, like what we're asking for is that the picture is much wider that we need to be looking at in terms of how we assess the problem. I don't think we're at a place where we can say we know how to fix it. We haven't really even assessed how deep the problem goes. But I think as we start to solve it, there isn't going to be like the big picture answer. I think we need experiments towards the solution, and that requires investments, because when you think about how much money went into supporting mediocre white solutions to these problems, and how much failure was supported to get to the cycle of some of the products that we have, we need to be able to support organizers and technologists and creators and dreamers in the same way from the global south. And that's both like in terms of marginalized communities in the United States, but also external to the United States. Because again, so many of the solutions that we need are not going to be coming out of the global north. They're going to be coming out of the global south. And I'm always struck by like the way so much of our technology drive is driven by how people compute in the US. Like even the fact that we had a personal computer. So this was developed by two white guys in their garage, and that's how we got a computer, right? But what would happen if you had, people in a village in Kenya or in India doing the same modeling? And I thought one of the ways, like when I was at the World Summit on Information Society in Tunis, at that time, people were experimenting in collective computing, because in a village context, you wouldn't imagine having everyone have their own computer. You would have one computer for the village. So it might not have been the PC. It might have been, the village computer. And so people were experimenting with like multiple mousing or ways that you could have multiple heads around a screen. It changes the way you understand how you want to engage and input data, as well as compute and build the technology infrastructure based on your, historical and material conditions. And so I think that it's really, really critical. And I think for us, like in our work in Equality Labs, one of the pieces we're really like laser focused on is that there is a ton of caste bias within the entire pipeline of technology development, in global IT, because the caste bias of dominant caste engineers shape the culture of IT. It shapes the kind of products that they do, and also their visions for the kinds of algorithms that they're building. And it's a very dangerous, project, because, when you look at South Asia, like India is the second largest market in the world. We have, hundreds of millions of people that are being shaped, with technology of bias during a time of genocide. That is an incredibly vile and bizarre thing that it's shocking to me that more people are not talking about. But we're not able to see it because part of the colonial project is that it only sees the global north as a source of power, and it doesn't understand global intersectional practices. But if we actually look at the way colonization worked, it always hooked up with predator systems internal to the region, so that the project of decolonization
can I fuck?
Is both internal and external. And so I think that this comes really specifically to play with the work that we're doing now in the United States, where we've had to force all of these companies to
can I fuck that?
Oh boy, okay, I think someone is
Someone's bombing the
bombing.
yeah
with porn.
If the
I
admin
just-
can remove the person.
I just removed them. Sorry about that, folks.
It's okay. But I think, just to kind of like sum up what I was saying is that, I think what's very interesting is that when you look at Google, when you look at Twitter, when you look at Facebook, and you look at Microsoft, these are all companies that have significant Indian populations. Many of the companies like Google and Microsoft have Brahmins who are CEOs, right? And these companies do not have caste as a protected category. So do you see what I mean about the way bias works? And that when you talk about this in the lens of diversity, what this allows is for dominator culture folks to basically erase the structural discriminations and the ways that they bring bias into the company culture and the products they create, and then the markets that they then impact. So it's a lot for theorists and organizers to have to, like, unpack, a shitty process, when actually, one, this whole area needs to be heavily invested in, because we can't be band-aids on a cancer, right? It's a cancer.
Right.
So we've got to redo and reimagine everything. But the remarkable thing is that we are a joyous group of people who are incredibly brilliant in the face of violence. And so, let's invest in this possibility. I want to live in a world where we have, products developed with, with Sophia's books, like at the core of how people create, ethics related to the ways they build algorithms, free of bias. I want to live in a world where people have, in all of their companies, protected categories for caste and race and sexual orientation and gender, and actually have it be implemented. I don't want like this, like, really, milk toast, like diversity initiatives where it's like a workshop and it's done, but they're still like destroying democracies around the world. Like,
Right.
diversity doesn't really take into play, to context, genocide. And in a
Right.
real way, our companies, American companies, are causing genocide. And we're seeing the destabilization of our own democracy here because of it. So we just need to think differently, and, not in the Apple way, but like in the Malcolm X way, right?
I love it.
Yeah,
I
to maybe
love
add a little
that.
bit more, I know you're letting you ask about how did these things get into technology. I think it goes down in many ways to kind of Conway's law, right? Conway's law is that the communication setup of a company is reflected in how the products are actually made. You can look at a company and how they communicate, how they create teams, how those teams interact with each other. You can literally see that reflected in the system. I think that it happens almost, if you step back, in terms of like, well, how do companies understand how to communicate? Well, you see it's from a caste system and the ways that the militaries of these powers used and deployed force to take out native peoples and to infiltrate their economies and to, as has been said by the other panelists, to extract wealth from those people. That's how you get the term master slave, right? A terminology for how computer hardware controls each other, right? You see that way of looking at people and how we look at computing technology. But I love how Dr. Noble talked about the automobile and its evolution and how, this supposedly opening up of America, and you have this, grand view of going from coast to coast in a car with the U.S. system of highways, but then vast amounts of the population being denied that. But then you see Victor Hugo Green creating the Green Book for Negro motorists, right? Commonly called the Green Book, which was something that this person in New York City decided needed to be done and created. And it was a way for Black motorists to navigate the system of oppression, this highway system of oppression and denial, to find places where you could get something to eat, where you could use the bathroom, where you could go to a hotel and sleep overnight. And so that kind of scrappy grassroots movement that resulted in the Green Book, we can have that same spirit as well in coming up with different ways to look at systems where we can take, instead of having a model of the computer, as was so beautiful said, we can look at new ways of thinking about computing and technology and access. But it will require education. Will require letting the people know the great costs that come with these systems, and also the impure interests that are being served by them. And I think people have to do the work to understand that before they're even be able to accept better solutions.
Great. I'm glad everyone raised different perspectives and very enriching thoughts on this issue. I want to focus on the capital. I mean, is there a way to compete with this capital flow? And one of the questions from Professor White says that sadly, almost no venture capital flows to non-white co-founders. How can venture capital be deployed in more equitable ways to minority co-founders and startups focusing on the global South as a market?
Well, one thing we want to know about venture capital is that venture capital is like some of the worst money you can get when we talk about an extractive model of return on investment. So, it isn't necessarily that, in many of our communities, we have a saying that all money is not good money. So, it's worth thinking about what other ways can capital be redistributed? I mean, that is ultimately a very, very important question when we're talking about decolonization. We cannot talk about it, in my opinion, without talking about restoration and reparation. There has to be, you don't get to start from a clean slate, let's say, even if we, dismantled Facebook or Google. So I think one of the things we've been trying to think about in our center at UCLA is can we enumerate in any way the cost to the public and to various publics, because we know the cost is disproportionate to poor people and to poor people of color. What is the cost of things like not paying taxes, which the tech sector for the most part does? They do not pay taxes. They enjoy every kind of tax break, from local municipal tax breaks, publicly subsidized office spaces, you name it, land grabs that they indeed are involved in. They offshore their profits. And of course, this is a huge issue as well. So when you take into account that they also skim the cream of the best students coming out of universities, and the best and most experienced, right, best people kind of coming into their institutions. These are people who could otherwise work in the public sector or work in other capacities that would be of value to the public. I mean, part of the what we're dealing with is like a system of profiteering off of the public, and dismantling at the same time public interest, democratic counterweight institutions and organizational efforts. And by that I mean, I work as a UC professor, I'm a state employee, I work for the public. I can't even tell you how fragile public higher education and public K through 12 is right now, especially in California, but all over the country. How can that be when Silicon Valley and Silicon Beach are right here in California? Well, how that can be is that these companies don't pay taxes. And so there's nothing going into the coffers for the public. So we have to talk about transfers of wealth that are happening. I mean, under the last 4 years of federal tax policy under the Trump administration, we saw the largest, greatest transfers of public wealth into private hands in the history of the United States. So let's think bigger than venture capital. All right, let's just talk about these companies not being allowed to exploit the public in these ways. You know, I often say to policymakers, hey, listen, it's important to regulate big tech, but if you seek to regulate them while you simultaneously defund every public democratic counterweight organization and institution, public libraries, public education, public health, public media, well, then, you know, there's actually not much to talk about. All right, what we're talking about is the transfers of wealth into the coffers of these companies out of, and of course, COVID-19 has laid bare how profoundly fragile our public institutions are. And of course, public institutions are indeed the way in which so many people of color have become literate, have had access to the right to vote, have been able to access housing. It's public policy and public institutions that have enabled that work. I mean, we have to, if we're going to talk about any kind of democratic or other kinds of institutional counterweights, we have to talk about like what is working in opposition to them to actively dismantle them. It goes beyond voter suppression. It goes to all of these other issues of corporate offshoring. And I think that those are the kinds of things we should be talking about. Then there would actually indeed be plenty of money for public interest technologies and plenty of money for experimentation. Instead, what happens is the public right now today, and for the last 50 years of the internet, has subsidized all the risk involved in the development of technologies through NSF grants, the National Science Foundation, NIH grants, all of the other kinds of DARPA, all of the other ways in which the federal government has taken public tax money and subsidized all the risk for the venture capitalists so that they don't have to put their money up. We put the public money up to figure out if these technologies are going to work. And then once they figure out they can make some money off of them, no return on investment comes back to the public. No return comes back to NSF or to anybody else. And of course, these are profoundly unfair, unethical, immoral systems, and that we can do something about, and indeed we must.
And I just wanted to also like build off of that. There's actually another really great flow of capital we can take back from these companies too, which is, I would like to, just lean in, taking a page from Sheryl Sandberg, lean into reparation. I feel like, in terms of corporate social responsibility, these companies have disrupted more democracies than the CIA. And yet with Cambridge Analytica, with the Rohingya genocide, with, a pogrom in India and, more growing atrocities, why isn't there a conversation about the repair to these societies after they've done such harm? I can say with confidence, there's no one here that wants to ever live through another election like this one. And the fact that we had Kenosha, and that there were, numerous attempts to try to get Facebook to get those militia pages off that were calling for direct calls for violence, and it was not taking down. And then we saw the tragic outcomes. The fact that just yesterday we had armed people going to the Philadelphia Convention Center to try to, with a car full of guns, to go after those ballot counters that are, of course, mostly BIPOC people who are doing that work. Again, it shows that these companies are playing a role in the destabilization of our democracy. And even if they took the budget for their cereal bars, took that budget and then paid reparations from that, we would have so much money to be able to rebuild and reimagine this world after harm. But I think it takes us understanding that we have more power here as citizens than we do as users. And I think we buy into their marketing when we think that we don't have a stake in the ability of how these companies function, how they are built, and also how they can be dismantled. And I think particularly as we look to antitrust regulations, as we look at building our own models, I think that we should not approach this as if we're in a position of lack. We have deep abundance, deep strategy, deep intelligence. I think we just need to stop accepting the beggar bowl that they're giving us and throw that away and start putting the accountability hat that they need to be wearing. And if they don't, do everything in our power to basically dismantle these corporations, because we are not doing anything for the good of our people to come out of COVID and putting people right back into a data jail with these folks. And I think that, what we're seeing is that they're just accelerating their surveillance capitalism, during the COVID period, and they don't care. At this point now, there are so many, countries that have gone into atrocity because of the business choices of these companies. And we have our lives, we have our futures to build for. We don't need to be just, blood that fertilizes, Zuckerberg's profits. I speak to this as someone who was doing a lot of moderation during the Delhi pogroms. I was so mad. I can't tell you the experience of what it was to have to watch a pogrom happen on social media. I've been telling Facebook that a pogrom was impending for over 2 years and watch them not listen because, again, they had a complicit actor at the head of that company for all of South Asia. And they did nothing about it. They did nothing about it. So I am really at a point where I don't, we need to stop believing the marketing. We need to stop we don't need to hear even what they say when they're doing their congressional briefings, that's not even real. What is real is their actual business practices. And that's all we have to see it all around us. And we need to demand more for the future of our people. We cannot accept this. We went through colonization the first time. Why are we willingly accepting another noose when it comes to this new version of it? and to decolonize is not like an intellectual project. It's a project of the spirit, and it's a project for the future.
Love that.
Love that
So
too.
reparation, redistribution of capital. Anwan, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that that's been fantastic, and these two powerful women have said it. So I'm just going to say,
I agree.
beautiful.
Um, so what are your thoughts about how to break into this space in terms of inclusion? Diversity has shown that there are limitations to just diversity. What do you have to say about that?
I mean, we've broken into this space. I will say that we're here. We're not going anywhere. These conversations are happening. I can tell you, since I'm the old bird on this panel, I will say that 10 years ago, you couldn't get this many people to come out and have a conversation like this, and certainly not with the level of just analysis that's so good, because these issues were really not quite in the like zeitgeist yet, and here we are. I mean, I can remember what it was like being a graduate student, and I kid you not, 10 years ago, just trying to find 4 people who'd put their careers on the line and back my claim that technology can be racist all the way to the level of code. I mean, there were people who, trust me, who dropped off the committee, who were like, no, can't do it. And look where we are now. So, I mean, I think that unfortunately, a lot of people of color, a lot of women, a lot of LGBTQ journalists and scholars, as I mentioned before, we've pushed a boulder up a mountain in trying to make these issues legible. But see, now we face a new challenge, which is to not let our critiques and the work of the past decade or more be captured by these corporations who now have put themselves in charge of solving the problems, right? The reformed tech evangelists who now are the tech reformers, who somehow are at the front of the line, with weak ideas. All right. So I just want to remind us that we come from the traditions of people who have a lot of experience with liberation, and who understand indeed at a cellular level what is at stake if we do not kind of fight through and resist these technologies, these paradigms. And just to remind us that I'll give you a simple shift. I often say to my undergraduate students that when I was born, I'm sure the doctor had a cigarette in his mouth. My mom probably chain smoked a pack of cigarettes right after she pushed me out. It was the 70s, you guys. My students can't believe that. They just can't believe it. It's so hard. But look what we did to shift the paradigm around big tobacco. So what I'm saying is we have so much evidence of our success, whether it's that our grandparents or our great grandparents were enslaved, whether it was that our lands were stolen, all of the ways in which we have been suppressed and still we rise. So I think it's not a question of will we break into the space. We are the space that offers the best thinking, rooted in long, thousands of years traditions of resistance. And what we need to do is draw back on the strength of that, believe that we will indeed win in these conversations. Yeah, we have trillions of dollars of investment in marketing materials to sell us these new technologies of oppression. But so what? We've also we disrupted the logics of the transatlantic slave trade. There was a time when people used the exact same arguments. They said the whole economy, the whole foundation of the Americas is built on the transatlantic slave trade or on the institution of chattel slavery. How can we undo it? The whole country's economy will tank. Those are the same arguments they use right now around the internet and big technology and software and hardware. I just would argue that, again, let's pull back to the level of paradigm and think about what does it take to shift a paradigm. And what it took was a handful of abolitionists in every case. Relative to the millions of people who were affected, it was a small handful of abolitionists. And I think that with this panel, we are part of that tradition of abolitionists who are thinking, about what are the points of leverage, right? It's leverage that throws a boulder, not millions of people, right? We have to figure out what are our points of leverage. And I think that these conversations are really powerful in helping us to refine our thinking. And so I just remind us, we're here and we've been here.
Yeah, just
That
to
is
add to that, yeah, if I may, we're, as Dr. Noble said, we're here, we're growing, and my main concern to people who are watching here, who are coming into this movement, maybe fresh, is don't be discouraged by the people who, turned their profile picture to black a few months ago when Black Lives Matter was trending, the people who march and maybe even cried over George Floyd and then turned around and voted for 45. Those people are going to fall off. Don't ignore them. Stay in this fight. Keep coming to events like this. Educate yourself. Get access to the resources that are being shared here. As again, Dr. Noble said, we changed the game when it came to cigarettes and smoking cigarettes. We changed when it came to gay marriage. As MLK said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But it doesn't happen by itself. It's people sitting on the necks of our oppressors and saying, enough is enough. We're not going to take it anymore. And so if you're here in this fight with us, please continue to stay here, continue to come to these events, continue to talk to people and bring more people in, because we're going to win. We are going to win. I think history is on our side, and really, more importantly, justice is on our side.
And I would also add that it also is just good business. I'm sorry, you will not have people in the global north be able to design for the needs of the next billion users. They don't know what it is to live without AC. They don't know what it lives to live in like a village where you have to go and get water by walking 5 kilometers, and what it means to have to like hustle around like all of the different duties of your house, as well as the work that you do for the many hustles that you have. But the people who do know how to do it are our communities, the frontline communities. And there are incredible innovators there that just need to be unleashed. And they need to be unleashed not in a predator economic model that just continues surveillance capitalism. They need to be able to experiment in ways that actually also empower solidarity economies. So the innovation isn't just, I think in thinking about, what Sophia was talking about, like decolonizing the whole stack. It's also about decolonizing the economic model. It's decolonizing our relationships fundamentally with the earth, with each other, and across nations. Because I think in some ways, the two crises that we are dealing so deeply with, whether it's this pandemic, but also climate change, will irrevocably change the way we understand our supply chains. And if we continue doing business as usual, as whole parts of these markets destabilize, while the global north still wants to penetrate those markets, there will be a market, but there won't be people. And that's not a future that we can afford. We need to be able to build experimental, resilient kinds of technologies that help us adapt to the great volatility ahead, but also center solidarity ways that we understand our relationships of material economic engagement. And many of those communities do have that. You have so many ways people have thought about circles of giving and microloans that came out of people putting into collective practices. I think that, but that world of solidarity economics is very different than the business models empowered by venture capital in the global north. And we just need to be, we just need to free our revolutionary imagination to not be limited by people in the valley, right? And to say, what, we are much more savvy and sophisticated as a global revolutionary imaginary. Let's think about it. Let's think about what it would take to build a computer device that we could eat or throw away. Let's think about what it would mean to create like a cell phone that was like under $10, but didn't involve like materials that involved a child doing mining in the Congo. right? Every time I hear Elon Musk being praised as like a green entrepreneur, you just have to think, what's in that battery? Where do those materials come from? He is from South Africa. He comes from a community that built their backs off of apartheid. And when he talks about being a green innovator, how can that be when we are still seeing children in mines in Africa with the materials of his products? That just makes no sense. We are buying the marketing, but not really living in freedom. And I think that's what really needs to change. And we need to empower ourselves to think outside of the ways people are telling us that diversity exists, and really fight for real freedom and innovate for real freedom and build for real freedom. And that comes with like being bold and experimenting and trusting yourself, because we're gaslit at every level from the system. And so when you surround yourself with other like-minded experimenters, you're like, okay, there's all that noise, right? But like, let's build the future right here, whatever that looks like, you know? And, you know, Sophia's right. Like, you know, it's so much easier for people to say, oh my God, I was a startup creator and I just like didn't have a job and I lived in my parents' like basement. But how much generational wealth allowed you to live that lifestyle, right? You know, and for every entrepreneur of color that is like, you know, they're having to work that second job and pay for their family, or if they're a first generation earner, so they're sending money back home, that same hustle is not happening with the same equity, right? So I think it's really about, we are in the material engagements we are right now because of the current system, but we don't have to stay here forever. And I think thinking about ways we can center collective practices to shift out of this model and be ambitious about our asks and be ambitious about our builds, that's really where we need to go. And that's how we decolonize, and that's how we de-Brahmanize.
Great. A lot of uplifting and positive remarks on this. I also wanted to touch upon, as we're nearing the end, but I really wanted to touch upon the issue of the digital divide. So the World Bank, the UN, and other international organizations they all have similar narratives. They're calling for closing the digital divide, leaving no one behind, which the digital divide is based on the assumption that plugging poor countries into the internet will help them to become rich rapidly. And we're talking about ICT access here. So how should this issue be approached in the first place? And when this agenda will be pursued, technologists and tech corporations will be highly likely to be involved in this goal. So do these corporations have equity in mind when they're involved in this agenda? And keeping in mind that these international organizations originate from the global north.
Lion, could you ask the question? I'm not sure I quite followed it.
What are your thoughts about the digital divide? How should the issue be approached, since it's one of the top priorities of international organizations right now, to close the digital divide?
Well, you know, one of the challenges here, I think, is that the responsibility for, well, I'll pull back and say that part of the language of the digital divide is also about opening new markets for capital in this sector. So I think we have to ask ourselves kind of, what are we talking about when we talk about the digital divide? Are we talking about the encroachment of Facebook into new markets with something like free basics, which then becomes the only way by which communities can access the internet, which is to access Facebook? We want to remember that many people around the world, their experience of the internet is Facebook. So I think we have to kind of unpack a little bit what we're talking about when we talk about what it means to close the digital divide. Many times what we see is that's just about opening up new markets for products and services by the same players that we've been talking about. If we're talking about increasing access to knowledge, to education, to literacies of various types, those all actually don't have to be delivered via YouTube, right? Or again, via social media companies or Google search. What we know from the research is that there's a huge threat to American companies, tech companies, being granted the power and responsibility to close the digital divide, whether that means putting up their own satellites to provide network connectivity and surveilling the populations that they are indeed networking to the internet, whether that is eroding indigenous languages and other and kind of creating monoculture, American monoculture in English around the world. I mean, there's actually a lot to talk about when we talk about what it means for governments and NGOs to use these so-called off-the-shelf technologies to close the digital divide. There are these other kinds of much more impactful economic and cultural imports around what we mean. In some places, people are trying to be divided. In fact, to unplug, to not be known to the network, to be outside of the systems of surveillance. Indeed, that has started with Silicon Valley's own children, where Silicon Valley executives don't allow their children to be on social media, don't allow their nannies to put pictures of the kids up, can't be on the devices. So I think we want to think about, having our eyes wide open about what it means to be kind of in the network and how, on what terms, and at what cost. And again, this is where I think the tactical research and of scholars, the work of investigative journalists, and more importantly, the work of community organizers in really helping us understand what we're talking about when we're talking about any of these things gets really important and nuanced. And I just want to kind of address that because there was a question in the comments about, like, maybe that we're just talking about theory, but I want to say that, the way in which people are responding to these kinds of entrapments happens at the local tactical level. That's where people resist, or they're able to articulate the harms and speak back. And those are not theoretical. Those are actually very material, real lived experiences and storytelling that happens. Of course, this is very important when you start talking about refugees, which more and more people in the world are becoming refugees because of climate crisis. So we have to understand that these models of carcerality, quite frankly, of whether it's unique identification numbers, whether it's the way in which the United Nations deploys resources, whether it's electronic borders, all of these things are really important and I think should be part of what we're talking about when we talk about being digitally divided.
Thank you so much for that thorough answer. I think you covered a lot in there. And I think we're run out of time, unfortunately, but I'm so glad to have this amazing panel. I hope everyone enjoyed the discussion, and I personally did, and I definitely gonna continue following your work. It's very inspiring. Thank you so much for being with us at the DIR conference. And thank you also for the organizers for this, for organizing and then coordinating this online. And thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
And I'd just like to add, for those of you who are still around, our programming continues right at 3:15. There are 2 more panels that you can choose from. One is the gender panel, and the other is the health panel. So check out your program guide and get the Zoom links for those because they'll be starting right at 3:15. All right. Thanks everyone for this. And Lion, great job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Take care.